Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to episode 7. In this week's episode, AJ and I talk about the vital role of core values in the church. There is a hidden hand in your church, and they're called core values. These values guide your church and make decisions for you. Most of the time, churches are unaware of the sway that values have on their congregation. AJ and I walk you through a definition of values and how you can discern the difference between the good, the bad, and the aspirational values in your church. To read today's show notes, visit malfersgroup.com/7, the number 7. If you find this podcast helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your friends in ministry. Now, let's dive in.
All right, Scott. Well, it is great to be back this week, and we're talking about values. This is it's a topic that I think we both really like, and I think we've really, over the years, developed some really interesting and maybe unique ways of looking at it, explaining it to the churches that we work with. So this is a great topic for us to jump into today and kind of walk through why do values matter in the church, and what are the proper ways that we should be looking at values?
Yeah, values like mission is not one of those fun topics where you're like, man, I can't wait to talk about values. It's not one of those big splashy topics, but it's a necessary one. And so it's why we want to spend this episode and actually next episode as well, spoiler alert, also talking about values.
Yeah. It's not one of those things that if you skip it, there's gonna be a hole. You're probably gonna feel there's a hole somewhere down the line, like something. It feels like we're not able to stay on track. There's something out there missing, and likely this is probably the missing link.
It's usually one of those things where churches will say, well, we made a really good plan. We got this plan together. We had really good ideas, and then we sputtered out, 4 months in, 5 months in, 6 months in, a year in. Why? What happened? What broke down? We see this in churches all the time. Typically by the time they're talking to us, it's not the first time they've thought about revitalization. It's not the first time they've thought about doing some sort of strategic planning, but and they're really frustrated. And usually the thing that has held them back from being successful in the last time they tried was some sort of deficiency in their values.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times, though, it's not because they haven't at some point sat down and actually considered what they value. Mm-hmm. A lot of the churches that we work with and see out there actually do have a list of values. And
somewhere on their website.
Right, yeah. Somewhere on their website, hanging on the walls of the church somewhere, or perhaps really lost to time. But at some point they did it. And so the problem there wasn't that they didn't consider great values. The problem is that they didn't know what to do with the values. They didn't understand that there's an action that should be driven by the values. Mm-hmm. So it could be, maybe you're listening and your church has never talked about values, or maybe you're a church that has talked about values, and you might not even know it yet, that the values work that you've done, while good, didn't take root anywhere and really help drive your church forward. So that's what we're going to get into today.
Yes, it is. So let's start today by actually just defining core values. And that sounds really simplistic, but core values is another one of those terms like mission, like vision, that we use a lot but don't define. So let's just start with a simple definition. This comes from Aubrey Malfers, as you would probably guess from this podcast and who produces it, the Malfers Group, that we might use a Aubrey Malfers definition. But it's this. Aubrey defines core values as the constant, passionate core beliefs that empower and guide, that's a key word, they guide the ministry. So let's break that down a little bit. AJ, let's talk about how values are constant.
Yeah, values should be constant. This is not something that you're going to get the team back together every year and go, okay, what's going to be our values for 2020? Mm-hmm. Your values should stay really very consistent for a very long period of time.
Yeah, and it speaks to the nature of them too. Like even if you, and this is jumping ahead, but even if you want to change what your values are, that's a long game. You don't just go, well, here are my values this year, and next year my values will be different. If even if you see that you need to change them, it takes time to change them, because the nature of core values is that whether you want them to be or not, they are constant. Like they're things that stick with you. Okay, so secondly, they're passionate. They're things that your church is passionate about.
Yeah, values typically have kind of an emotional element to it. The things
Mhm.
that they're a lot of times we're going to talk about this coming up, but they're on an unconscious level. You're being driven to do something because there's sort of an emotion attached to it. Values are instinctual.
Yeah, and so for example, like let's take a practical application of how the emotional part, the passionate part of values expresses itself. So when someone starts talking about um, changing carpet in the sanctuary or whatever, or painting over a mural or whatever, and someone starts to go, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't change that carpet. You can't paint over that mural." It's not that someone has like doesn't like new carpet. It likely has some sort of connection to something that they value, maybe in the facility or in keeping things the same way or in, not liking change, whatever it is. They've got some sort of value attached, and that carpet or that mural is just sort of a physical manifestation, a sign or a symbol of that thing that they actually value, and that's what they're
Yeah.
reacting to. It's a values reaction. It's never about the carpet or the mural.
That's a great point, Scott. And probably any discussion that starts with "you can't do that" or "we've never done it like that before," you probably are heading off into a values discussion. And that could be where a lot of things break down
Mhm.
because leadership in the church isn't really thinking about it from a values point of view. But if you get under the hood into what's driving that resistance to something,
Mhm.
then we have a disconnect in our values, maybe between what the church's stated or perceived values are versus maybe that individual or group or even entire congregation.
Always. That's why if you try to attack it from a head level and go, well, this just makes sense, or it's going to achieve X, Y, or Z. Those arguments don't matter at all to those folks because it's not addressing what's behind it, which is not something logical. It's values. It's at the heart level.
Yeah.
So,
So, all right. So, the next kind of action piece out of that definition is that the values should empower and guide the ministry. So, this is where we're really starting to get into, I think, the meat of the values as a tool in the church. Don't you?
yeah, and this is sort of uh, immediately connected to that emotional part, right? That we are, as human beings, as God has designed us, primarily emotional beings. We Chip and Dan Heath wrote a book. I think it might have been their book Switch, but it talks about this idea um, that a person's mind is like an elephant and a person riding the elephant, and the driver of that elephant is like the logical brain, and most of the time you can move the elephant with logic, but when the elephant decides it wants to go somewhere, it doesn't matter what that driver does. That elephant is going.
Yeah.
And values are like that. Values are almost like the elephant. You know, it doesn't really matter what plan you make. The thing that really empowers and guides the church is the elephant. And so if you want to change your church, you have to start with the elephant. And that's why we do that in our process.
Yeah. For the leadership of the church, the most important thing then, whenever you're trying to keep the elephant from steering itself, is to raise what those felt, passionate, instinctual values are from an unconscious level to a conscious level. Bring
Definitely.
it basically up into that intellectual space where the feelings behind that can be logically discussed, whether it's merited, whether it's beneficial to the direction that the church wants to go.
Yeah. Is this the elephant we want to be riding or not? You
Yeah.
know, and you can change which elephant you're riding, but you can't do it if you don't know what elephant you're riding. So, um, all right. So let's dive straight in. Now that we've sort of defined values, hopefully that's been a helpful discussion for those of you who have heard about core values, but maybe have never really thought about how they function. There are really three types of values, and we're just going to call them good, bad, and aspirational. We'll dive through each of those in a little bit more detail. But another way to think of them is healthy, unhealthy, and aspirational. But it's kind of more, you know, Westernish, just call them the good, the bad, the aspirational.
Can we insert some Sergio Morricone music in right here?
Spaghetti Western.
Oh,
Yeah, all the
that's,
way.
I gotta say, that's probably one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, and all the people who are younger than me are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So, all right. I might edit this out. Let's just discussion on spaghetti.
Golden podcast material right there.
Oh my goodness.
All right.
We'll find out in the comments if that's
good values. Good values. We also call them healthy values. So there's a couple of primary things when we talk about good values. The first one is that it's actionable. It's what we were just talking about. We're talking about action towards a good end.
Action towards a good end. Yeah, exactly. Secondly, good core values drive desirable results. They don't just drive results, they drive the results that you're looking for. This might seem really simple, but you have to sort of consider the end so that you can develop the appropriate means. And so one of the things as we talk about discipleship pathway, and we'll have episodes on this later down the road, but these values start to determine the outcomes you want to see, and you start to program around those outcomes. So those values determine those outcomes. So let's look at this in a really practical way, and we're going to do that by looking at the Bible. Imagine that. We're going to look at Scripture.
The Bible?
We could actually pick all kinds of different places to look at how values express themselves, but our absolute favorite place to look at this, because it's so succinct and so compact, would be Acts chapter 2, verse 41 through 47. If you are driving right now, please do not pull this up on in your Bible or your app. But if you're sitting here at your desk or at home and you want to follow along, we're going to look at Acts chapter 2, verse 41 through 47. Do you mind if I read it, AJ?
Please read it, Scott.
All right. It says, those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved.
Amen.
So just so you know, if you're not familiar, in Acts chapter 2, 41 through 47, this is giving a description of what the early church was like. So if you were part of the early church there, right at the very beginning of things, we have at the end of verse 41 sort of an event that happens, and then verse 42 through 47 sort of describes the culture of that early church and what it was like to be a part of that church. And so we will ask churches when we sit down with them, and if you're driving, don't do this, but pause this episode if you are listening at home and just think about it. Look at that passage again, and what do you think? What kinds of things do you think that they valued based on that description? So you could pause if you're doing that right now. If you're driving, don't pause, and then we'll list out for you. You might come up with more than 6, but we come up with at least six, I should say, that everyone sort of tends to see. Every time we do this in a group, AJ, I think these same things come up again and again, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you could nuance these a couple, maybe a couple. Somebody might see something a little bit differently. And let me also say, I mean, I've counted. There's exactly 1.2 gazillion great things in Scripture that you could say that you value. Okay, and a lot of churches have
I
really.
Think you're exaggerating. 1.2 gazillion.
Yes, but there's just, I mean, seriously, compassion and love and justice. There's a million great things. All right, not a gazillion, only a million great things in the Bible. And I've seen churches with a lot of fantastic lists of really good things that they say they value. And that's good. Those are good things to value. I really believe that these Acts 2 values are great. 2 things about them. They're all actionable, and they're buckets in which almost anything else you could probably come up with will probably fit into one of these. So I think it's a really great way to have some areas in which you could really express a lot of really good things in your church, but still have them be actionable and helping move you forward.
Yeah. So let's identify just really quickly, because we're not trying to belabor.
Acts 2 Bible study.
Yeah. The point. Let's
All right.
just hop into them.
First, evangelism. We see that in verses 41 and 47, where their numbers were increasing. So the gospel was being presented to unbelievers, and many were giving their life to Christ. So,
and by the way, they were counting. So I guess the Bible is not against you counting. Just
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Others may not, but I do. I agree.
Teaching. We see that in verse 42, 46. Apostles were living out that second part of the Great Commission that we see and we talked about in previous episodes, that really not just making disciples but maturing disciples, not just the evangelism but the edification piece. We see that in verse 42, 46.
Next, we see fellowship. We see that in verses 42, 44, and 46. So that was not their, they didn't get together in the temple and then they said, hey, before you take your seat, turn around and shake the hand of somebody around you and say good morning. That was not the fellowship. They were in deep relationship with one another. It's cliche, a lot of churches say they were doing life together.
Yeah.
They had really deep, deep love and fellowship. I'm using the word to describe the word, but yeah.
Yeah, I would criticize potlucks, except one of the things that they did a lot was eat together. So, worship. So worship we see in Acts 2, 43, 46, 47, just this idea of loving God and living in awe of him and in obedience to him. And that's really what worship is. We might launch our lives into worship by singing and whatnot. I'm sure they did a lot of that, but the end of that worship was living in awe of God and in obedience to his word. We see that in Acts chapter 2.
Yep. Then in verse 45, we see service. I always say service / generosity. So this is certainly one of those areas that some churches want to split these up and maybe make a little bit more detail on these. But I like to kind of summarize it as time, talent, and treasure. They were generous with their time, their talent, their treasure. It says that they sold their possessions, gave to anyone who had need. I have to believe they were not simply giving cash, but they were helping people move furniture and cook meals and all those good things that we do for one another.
But still also giving cash.
And some cash.
Yeah. And we see prayer is something that, such an important and integral part of the Christian life, should be for all of us, but certainly was in the early church. It was something that as Jewish people they valued, and that certainly translated into their Christian life, and is something that we've kind of gotten away from, I think.
Yeah.
We kind of think that praying without ceasing is an exaggeration, but I don't think it was at all to Paul. I think he saw that as it was just a way of life, that you'd continue to have a text conversation with your spouse throughout the day. That's what your relationship with Christ ought to be like, that prayer is something that it's never turned off. And I think that's what prayer without ceasing means. It's like prayer doesn't have definitive start and end times. It's just a way of life.
Yeah. And I've seen a lot of churches that have basically done looked at Acts 2 values or adopted Acts 2 values, and frequently prayer is actually left off of the list, even though I think it's like one of the most clear things in that passage. But I think, raising it up to the level of values and keeping it in front of, your leadership in your church so that it is actionable, and it does still then help you as you're thinking through ministries and providing opportunities for people to grow in relationship with Christ, that prayer stays front and center. And you can even, be able to build in ministries in your church that highlight that this is a needed functionality.
So these are certainly not the only good values or healthy values you could have, but we would say that these are ones that are necessary to be a full and healthy church, right? Like there are other things that are also good, also healthy, and might make sort of your final list of values. But these ones we would almost consider essential biblical values that, if you don't have one of these components, chances are you're not going to have the discipleship outcomes that you want to have.
Yeah.
So as you listen to those 6 things, evangelism, teaching, fellowship, worship, service, generosity, prayer, that's 7 as I've said them, but we combine service and generosity. Um, there's a good chance that as you look at your church, you might go, well, we've got some of those things. That's very common that we would, maybe teaching, for example, or worship, fellowship, prayer. You'd look at your church and go, we're doing these things, we're living them out. That's awesome. What you can't do is look at something and go, yeah, we like that, and say that that's an actual core value. Just
Yeah.
because you think evangelism, say, is a good idea, you can't say it's an actual core value. If I press you and say, show me the proof, like prove to me that evangelism is an actual value of your church. And you go, well, we baptized a couple kids from VBS this past summer. I mean, I don't want to downplay that. That's great. But, if you've not baptized an adult in years, chances are you're not that effective in terms of evangelism. So you might like the idea of evangelism, but you can't say your church values it because there's no proof that that's the case.
Yeah, you have to push yourselves on this. This is not an exercise just to have something to do. I mean, there's a lot at stake, and you're trying to have your church be healthy and to make forward momentum making disciples. So
Mm-hmm.
take the time to do this. Be honest with yourselves. Challenge each other. Ask that question.
Yep.
Where's the proof?
Yep.
Where are we really living that out?
That's right. Going back to our elephant example, it does not do you any good to say we're riding an elephant that really values evangelism. If you're not, like, if that elephant is actually, on the other side of the jungle, like, because you're not going to achieve those outcomes. You're not going to operate out of that instinctually. You're not going to be chasing that kind of evangelistic vision if that's not really the elephant that you're riding on. And so you've got to be honest and say, here are the things we do value. And there's going to be good things in there. We're not saying that everything that your church values is bad. You probably do value a lot of good things. But do you value all of the things that you need in order to be healthy is the question.
Yep.
All right, let's move on to the second kind of values that we see in churches, and those would be the bad values or unhealthy values.
Yep. So if you have set your sights on making disciples and you're not finding a lot of forward progress in that,
Mm-hmm.
you likely, as we sort of set this up at the beginning, have a disconnect on your values. So
Mm-hmm.
bad values have got to be identified. If you choose to desire to be about the things that the Acts 2 church was about, then you've got a list of things on a piece of paper or up on the whiteboard or the wall. You can look and go, okay, we have things that we're actually doing that are outside of this list that we desire to be about. And some of them might be good, but not getting you where you want to go. Some of them might be bad. And
those are
so
the
that
ones we're really worried about. Because you
Right.
might have some values that are actually complementary. They're not those sort of essential 6, but they can still help you move the ball forward. It's those things that actually hold you back that are truly the bad ones.
Yeah. So, and like good values, we kind of have 2 things here that we'll say about bad values. First of all, they're unconscious. So we mentioned that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You're not really thinking about it. The church isn't thinking about what we value that makes us do a certain action or continue a certain ministry, or behave a certain way. So
there are things you might even be embarrassed to admit.
Sure, definitely.
You don't want to say, "Oh, we really value tradition here."
Right.
You wouldn't wear that necessarily as a badge of honor, but it might be true.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. That could be, behind that so often uttered phrase, we've never done it like that before.
Right.
That could be because tradition is a high value of the church, keeping things the way they are.
Yeah, let me give you a really concrete example. I was working with a church that we were going through this process, the values discovery process, and they had put on their board stewardship as a value, which kind of aligns with like generosity or this, it's in that vein, right? So we all thought, oh, this is a good thing that's going to continue forward. But as we were kind of having the discussion and going through the steps, which we're not going to get into all that, but one of the elders of the church just raised his hand and he said, okay, I've got to say it. What we actually value is being cheap. And everybody in the room paused for a second. And then I thought, oh no, what's going to happen? And then everyone just started dying laughing. And they said, yes, that's it. cheap. That's what we are. So for them, when they'd say, "Oh no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to change the carpet. We're not going to paint the wall." Behind it for them was not a love of tradition, although they had that to contend with as well. It was, what's that going to cost? That was really what was behind it, and they didn't want to spend the money on it.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so, they would say, "Oh, it's because we're trying to be good stewards." No, it's because they were actually cheap.
Yeah. Which is not being a good steward.
No, it's not. Nope. Yeah,
Stewardship does
absolutely.
not equal saving money
No,
all the time.
it can, but not always.
It can.
And
Yeah.
so, at any rate, I
That's
thought
a great
that was a
example.
good example of them
Yep.
just kind of having to call a spade and go, you know what's really happening here is we're cheap.
Yep. Yep. So the second piece of that is much like the good values, opposite, in fact, is that bad values drive undesirable results.
Yeah, undesirable results. Yeah.
Undesirable. So yeah, and I think your example really is really good for that. That was saving money at the cost of healthy ministry and moving forward on mission is an undesirable result. So
Mhm.
whether you call your value stewardship or cheap, that was not a good value because it drove an undesirable result for the church.
That's right. All right. Last but not least, aspirational values, AJ.
Yeah, so action I think has been a theme as we've talked about values. You've heard me and Scott talk about it in each of these aspects of values, and action is where aspirational values really come into play. So in this process, we identify some things that we say we're not doing this right now, but we realize now that we need to be. That's an aspirational value.
Let's take evangelism, for example. You might not be an evangelistic church right now, but you'd realize that you need to be an evangelistic church moving forward. So you wouldn't call that an actual good value that you have right now. You would call that an aspirational value, what you want to start to live in moving forward. There's a great book called Atomic Habits. It's by James Clear. And in that book, he talks about the importance of how you talk about yourself. He uses the example of a person who's quitting smoking, and he says there's actually a measurable difference in if someone who's quitting is offered a cigarette and they say, "Oh no, I'm trying to quit," they're more likely to actually accept a cigarette and to bail on quitting smoking than a person who says, "No, I'm not a smoker." Like without hedging and saying, "Well, I used to be a smoker. I'm trying to stop being a smoker." Like they just said, "No, I'm not a smoker." And that's really what aspirational values are like. You're saying, "This is who I am now. It may not have been who I've been, up to this point, but moving forward, we're going to talk about ourselves differently, which means we're going to start thinking about ourselves differently, which means we're going to start acting differently." And again,
Yeah,
as AJ is really driven home here, action is
yeah.
the key. And so how you talk about yourself matters. And aspirational values allow you to start talking about yourself in a new way, even if it's not been true of you in the past.
That's right. You're raising a banner. You're declaring, here's where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
So, but aspirational values are not supposed to stay aspirational.
No.
Aspirational values are in a temporary state. Now, you can't just change the values of your church in a week or two.
Nope.
So you might have aspirational values for a year or 2 years even as you're really trying to right your ship. Uh, Aspirational values need to be understood. You don't need to put something on your website like a chart showing what's actual, what's aspirational. But it does need to be known. The church needs to understand that you're trying to make yourselves move in a different direction. It definitely needs to stay front and center for your leadership team.
Yeah.
This should be something that at your elder meeting, deacon meeting, staff meetings, it should be brought up. Like, what progress are we making on our aspirational values? Because we've got to be able to retire that term at some point and be living out good values in the church.
Yeah, and the good news is if you follow a process like the one that we use, you're going to be able to actually measure your progress in living out those new values. It won't just be a pie in the sky. Well, I hope one day it's not aspirational. We give you concrete tools in the strategic envisioning process for you to go, yeah, we're actually doing that. Like that's who we are now. And it can stop being aspirational and start being true. And that can be as soon as 1 year in going, hey, we've got proof on paper that this is who we are now. And so one of the last things we want to say to wrap this up is is it's really important once you kind of decide, here are our values, here are the good that we want to keep, here are the bad that we're going to stop, here are the aspirational that we're going to add to who we are, that you really begin to walk in those things and know that that's not those negative things, those bad things, those unhealthy things, they're entrenched. And the second that you stop operating out of those things, some people are going to be mad. Some people are going to leave. Some people are going to stop giving or stop giving as much. Just expect that on the front end and don't bail on the process because there's a little bit of pain in that transition. You've
Yeah.
got to go full steam ahead to make the change, and then to go back on it later is sort of like a nail in the coffin. You'll lose all trust.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid. Just keep going. It's gonna be okay. All
We
of
should
the
also,
upside.
I think we should point out, your values should not be a dozen, 2 dozen values. Limit yourself. We typically talk about 6 to 8. It's not
Yeah.
in stone, but if you allow too many things to be valuable, nothing is valuable.
Mhm.
That's the law of diminishing returns at that point. So
Yep.
limit yourself on what you really say you value, because as if you stay tuned into the podcast, we're going to talk later on about discipleship pathway and strategy, and this plays a role. This is not just a one and done thing. This
Mhm.
has future implications, and a manageable set of values is important.
Yeah, really important. And whatever you say, you value. Us at the Malfers Group, if we're working with you in strategic envisioning, we're going to make you prove it, not just
Right.
now, but moving forward. And yeah, so I hope this has been a sort of a helpful introductory primer to the idea of core values, the good, the bad, the aspirational. Want to encourage you to hop online, go to malfersgroup.com/7, and that is where you'll find the article that goes along with this. Maybe print it off, share it with your board, have a good conversation, start that conversation about values in your church. Again, that's malfersgroup.com/7, and you will find that. Thank you so much for listening, for subscribing, for commenting, for sharing this with your friends in ministry. We'd love to get this content out to as many people as possible, and we rely on you to help us do that. So we appreciate your help in doing that, and so glad that you tuned in. We love you so much, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.